What's up, everyone? My name is Joe Laloon, and welcome to the Three Phase Podcast. Today, I'm joined by Charlotte Sobolewski, someone I worked closely with in Toronto while she was preparing to break a world record, and now operates at the intersection of AI, leadership, and performance. This episode matters now because we're in a time where data is everywhere. AI is accelerating fast, and people are starting to confuse information with understanding. Charlotte has lived both sides, pushing physical limits and working in environments where decisions carry real weight. There's a moment where she says,
the data can inspire you to know where the gaps are, to know where the opportunities are. That is the inner work you got to do to take all that and to motivate yourself.
And that really anchors the entire conversation. Wait until you hear how she breaks down where AI actually helps and where it quickly becomes a problem. Now let's dive into that episode.
The Three Phase Podcast is starting now.
All right, before we talk about AI, data, or decision making, I want to give some context for why Charlotte and I are having this conversation at all. Charlotte and I worked together in Toronto during a demanding chapter. She was coming back from a broken shoulder and preparing to compete at the Indoor Rowing Nationals. That wasn't a symbolic comeback. She returned to competition and stepped onto the podium with a bronze medal. Not long after, we began preparing for much bigger challenges and ultra-endurance efforts, including a 24-hour row at the world record level and preparation to row across the Atlantic in the Talisker Whiskey Atlantic Challenge. Since then, Charlotte has continued to put herself in demanding environments, from endurance sports to high rocks, and hosting multiple rounds of the Hard 75, while also building a career at the intersection of AI, leadership, and governance. Today, we're talking about human performance in the age of AI and what still can't be automated when pressure, data, and decision-making collide. Welcome, Charlotte.
Thanks, Joe. It's so good to see you again. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
It is great to reconnect, as always. So, most people don't wake up wanting to tackle a Guinness record. How did that idea land in your world?
It's a good question. I did not wake up wanting to tackle that either. I was a sprint athlete, so long or very short distances, like quick hits. I'd say adrenaline junkie. The thought about even rowing for 10 kilometers or more than that was something that I did not do. And if you remember, like when we started training together, like I'm in my early 40s now, I was in my early 30s, so almost a decade ago. Very different body chemistry, different age. And I had years of competitive athletic training, but was wired a bit differently. It's also, I think there's a mental component where I love kind of the quick hit and quick result. But I think as I got older and just having going through a number of injuries, seeing my body change and just having different time available, but wanting to still compete while I'm working like full time. Someone kind of dangled the opportunity to say, you never got to go to the Olympics. Wouldn't it be cool if? And you know me, I'm never someone to back away from a challenge, especially when I had a lot of folks tell me I couldn't do it. And so whether the stubbornness in me or the reality of it was kind of cool. I think I signed up for it, not really knowing what I was doing, to be quite frank. But I think you and I said, we'll kind of go and give it our best shot and see what happens. And I think a lot of it was just relying on the familiarity of the training and those patterns that were built over the years in discipline, but also looking at some of the different signals that were going to be really important as you're unlocking that next gear, which is very typical, I think, of, any of the people that you would coach, but especially in our coaching relationship around how do we show up and be the best version of ourselves. And so I think when that opportunity came up, it was really in preparation to go to row across the Atlantic. So while there'd be some sprint work there, it was a long haul. This is usually kind of targeted to be a 6 to 8 week race with your team. And so I think out of a little bit of fear and challenge, I thought it'd be a really good idea to see, could I test myself and push different limits? And second, really kind of work with you as you were really open around what are some of the different signals and different things that we can look at now to start to prepare ourselves to take that on. And, good news story that we were able to be successful. But I think, I've often said, we always are lucky to be able to do the hard things. And I think having the perfect combination of background and trust and really having success, knowing that I could take on the hard things, but with the right coaching and kind of, right approach, I was able to kind of do that, in a safe way and really hope for the best.
Yeah, it was such a cool experience, especially coming from, it's almost like taking a 100-meter sprinter and saying, okay, let's do an ultra marathon, basically the same concept. But I think for you, after working with you for as long as we were together, it's pretty impossible to dampen your competitive spirit. So I think any challenge, whatever it was, as much as we were like, yeah, let's give it a shot, it didn't take more than 48 hours for you to be like, here's what we're going to do. This is the strategy. We're going to set out this amount of time. This is what I would like to accomplish. Like you kind of took the steps right away to not only just do it, but really like go and do your absolute best, whether you were successful or not, you were going to give it your all.
Yeah. And I think then that's something, it's funny because if you think about it, it's a very different stage professionally, kind of at the time when we took on that challenge, which was, really a privileged challenge to be able to take on as a, former competitive athlete. I think that so many people I've worked with in my professional role, a lot of them are ex-competitive athletes and pro athletes. And people would always, either have one or two kind of approaches to this. One to say, never again. I've hung up my skates. I've hung up my skis. I'm good at keeping it as a nice memory and I'm going to focus elsewhere. Where others are kind of looking at, now we know so much more about the body, about the mind, about elements of performance, kind of how can I recast myself and take on new things in a safe way. And I think for me, what I approach it is I was having very similar conversations with my clients in a work world, looking at data, looking at signals. And I think for me, it was almost a privilege to take those learnings from my professional life that are very different. Like we're coding models, we're building products, geeking out about some of this stuff. And I'd always say to you, and I know we were sitting in, I think, a dietitian office to sit, and they were like, we've never met anyone like you guys that tracks data to this account. And I said, I'm ruined by my professional life. But I think the main message was that what I learned from both sport and the athletic world, and then from work was really the best performers really aren't the ones who ignore some of these other signals that go beyond, say, the traditional set that you as a coach or a trainer kind of look at. The same with me when I'm looking as a product leader, kind of a data-like owner professionally. It's really the best performers are the ones who listen early, listen often, and are able to adjust. And if I look back on our training protocols and what I've often shared, really as an example to my clients, is we're tackling really big complex things like data and AI to redefine healthcare systems, or looking at, some of the pressing issues a lot of my clients are facing. I often draw the parallels back to how we took on this daunting idea of like rowing across the ocean or setting a world record. Like, this wasn't something that just kind of fell into our lap. It came with having a vision, recognizing the data and the signals to kind of work back with a really intentional plan, and how did we still pivot and adjust along the way, because it wasn't a straight line. It was kind of like this. And I even up to the night before, you're like, are you ready? I'm like, well, I hope so. And so I think that's something that I take and apply both personally and professionally. And that's where I think that we're at a point in time where if others are looking to adopt a similar approach, that now we have the resources or some of the lessons learned to do that, whether in sport or in the boardroom.
Yeah, good point. What stands out to you now about how you approach preparedness back when we were going through that?
Yeah, I think it went from like, that we talk about it as we had a bit of a joke and, wouldn't this be interesting? But I actually think that we were pretty intentional, right? Like I'm always of the mind of like, I don't think when some people say, oh, I was successful and got there, I don't know how I got there is by accident. I actually think that we were actually pretty intentional. And so I look at it where we prepared, it was like, usually around the two, I break it into three buckets. And the first two, probably a lot of coaches you work with and have seen over the years do that. And I think what the differentiator was the third bucket that I'll talk to. So I think the first bucket was looking at body signals. So strength, endurance, body composition, like these are useful. And I think most individuals that I've had the pleasure working with, kind of track this, and this is the norm. So while important, are often incomplete. Hence why, you can be tracking to the perfect program, look at like the body composition, look at all those signals, and then you're not reaching your goal. But we did track that pretty intentionally. The second one, equally important, is the correlation or relationship to load signals. So this is all of our training plans. So the volume, the lifting, the rowing, all the activities I was doing outside of the time that you and I were training together, and there was significance of that. And that included some of the fueling. So the fueling around the carb cycling, the dietitian. So really looking at that complete ecosystem of how we were tracking and working back from those weekly targets and that. And this told me what my body was asking me to do, right? And so if we knew we had a heavy leg day that I knew the day before, here's how I would modify some of my rowing, modify the fuel for my body. And so it allowed me to still work back from that plan because it was allowing me to say I was training for a very intentional purpose. Again, really useful, but still incomplete. I think when I look back at some of the plans where really that extra gear unlocked is really looking at other signals, which I think are now becoming more important, just maybe not, typically the norm. And this was what I call almost the breakthrough, is that kind of mental and life signal. So what was my mood, my motivation, my stress like? What was my sleep quality? Super important, which I always really sucked at. How do you do this on 5 or 6 hours sleep? And importantly, like what was happening in my personal life, right? And I think that these are important things that we don't typically track, but you and I had that trusted relationship where you would push me to say, look, like maybe you have a really high volume and like your training load in that, but your personal load's high. Maybe just skip the day of training and just do more mental visualizations, meditate. Equally as important. And I found that was something that if I look at the volume from when we were competing at the national level, and then we shifted through to my output in the 24-hour row, my training volume actually cut in half. It was the other exercises, meditation, the mindfulness, helped me figure out how I could be a lot more grounded in kind of what my body could do, what it was asking me, but be aware of how I could pivot. So I wasn't feeling this like pressure to hit all these checklist things. And, I wasn't surprised that training improved. And so these are that third bucket I think is important. And when we track the data, you saw the first two buckets, like, that you saw training load and strength start to go up. You started to see performance go up. But interestingly enough, sometimes you see strength and performance go up, but then you see the body metrics kind of go like this and get compromised, that we saw like a double parallel line. Which I think was a good signal to say, okay, we got it right. And so these are things I think are really important around kind of how we see those parallels and what the new approach was.
Yeah, at the time too, obviously this is way pre-AI, but we were definitely leveraging the technology that was available to us at the time. I think one thing that was really special for me was the fact that you were dialed into the goal. Obviously, this is something you wanted to accomplish, and I really got to work with you and try a bunch of new stuff out that I'd never done with clients before. So just a reminder of a few of these things, because it'll tie into this, is, we were using like the Polar HR10 heart rate monitor. So we would do live heart rate monitoring in the gym setting, in the conditioning setting. We were also using that to do the HRV daily test with now on Whoop. It just tells you, it gives you a daily score, but we were going to, I think it was called Elite HRV. We would do a daily score. It would give us like a readiness score. And so as much as we were using the technology to help guide us in terms of like what the training volume would be on that day, or the intensity would be, or whether we wouldn't train at all and maybe you do something like fascial stretching on that day, or mindfulness or visualization. We also wanted to have, so that was our objective feedback. We also wanted to have the subjective feedback, so we could really show or see that, a day maybe you did have a high HRV score and you felt good, but you knew I've got all this stuff coming up for work and it's got me really stressed out. And even though I feel rested, I don't really feel like locked in the way that I want to go do this squat workout for the day. So it was a lot of communication back and forth and leveraging the available technology to us at the time. The other thing I just was remembering too was early days. I think it was still a pilot at this time, but it was a friend of yours, and we did the personality test to see, and it worked out really well for us. We sort of,
really
I was the yin to your yang, and it worked out really well that way, where what you needed I was able to provide, and vice versa. But we were just trying to do use as much as we could to be as efficient as possible in getting to that goal.
Yeah, and I think that's something that's important, right? Because I think the trainer or the coach coachee relationship has changed a lot, especially with all the tech, right? And I'm the first one to go, this is really cool. But the one thing I find it's interesting that and this is the same I find if I draw the parallel to my work, the numbers don't tell the whole story. And I think part of it, you can't have a gadget that automates trust. Like someone could say, well, you have all these gadgets now, do you need a coach anymore? And I'm always the first to say, of course you need a coach, because you also need to have someone there to actually give you a bit more confidence, and that it's that awareness. And so for me, part of it is like, we could go back and we could pull up the numbers and go, oh, this is really interesting. And we probably remember back. But I think the main thing, at least for me, when you asked like that, like the question before about, how do you know that you were ready or approach, getting a world record? Well, for me, it was just, I became a lot more confident and self-aware of the limits of my body. I didn't even have to look at the numbers anymore. And so I think that that's something that's really important. It's the same when all these apps are coming out and people can use AI to generate their own training plans. Great. But the value is really in the awareness, and it's the space in between the numbers, which is called judgment, to be able to pivot, to align, to adjust the program so you can still like track toward a goal. And that's where I think kind of the secret sauce that I hope the fitness and wellness industry kind of picks up on a lot more, because I think it credentializes the experience that someone, as good as you are, that no one can get in your brain and be Joe. Like that is you. And I think from like a client perspective, that I find that that's what's like kind of the chemistry in the space in between, where you can build greater confidence and awareness that you can reach your goals faster.
Pardon the interruption for a quick word from our sponsors. If you're someone who's training hard, managing stress, and trying to stay consistent with your recovery, Cala Red Light is something I've been using more and more with both myself and clients. Red light therapy helps support recovery, reduce inflammation, improve sleep quality, and overall just helps your body handle the load you're putting on it, whether that's from training or just life. It's one of those tools that fits really well into a high-performance routine because it doesn't add more stress, it actually helps you adapt to it. If you want to check it out, I've got a direct link in the show notes. No discount code necessary. Now, let's get back to hearing more from Charlotte on where data actually helps and where it can start to replace real decision-making if you're not careful. Yeah, and that awareness piece too of like knowing yourself and knowing, what is a good day, what is a bad day, what are your limits, what are your limitations. And I will just give a little bit of context. Charlotte is a bit of a freak athlete, and the limits were hard to find, I will say. I still tell people, about, especially when we were trying to really find like lactic thresholds and we were trying to see what your, work capacity like levels were. And I would write down these like test programs, and I'm reading them back to myself going, this is nuts. Like, this is insane. This is going to kill her. It's going to kill her. And then we're watching your heart rate, kind of creep up throughout the test. Okay, 170, 175, 180. And then, okay, that's good. We're done. And then I'm watching the clock, 30 seconds in. Okay, we went 180 to 110. Okay, 60 seconds in. We're back to 60, so, but we had to really like push those limits. One, to see, what the capacity was, but also mentally to feel like, what does the limit feel like? So then when we are training or you are competing, we know when we're getting close to that, or if we're living in the right range as we're going through that stuff. So that, that is all subjective. That is how you feel. That is what you can personally handle. It's not like, age minus 220 minus your age to get a heart rate max. There are very different subjective things that happen between the numbers, as you said.
Yeah, and that's why I think there's been this popular demand or interest in high rocks, and we can debate the science of it, if it's safe, and how people are performing. I think that's still like the jury's out on that. But I think what's really interesting, and I've gone to watch some of the elite best humans in the world. I've seen the adaptive, and what's interesting is just that there's the people and the athletes who have performed like top incredible awareness and mindfulness about limits of their body. And I think until you go through that experience on paper, like as you just said, it sounds nuts, but I had been through so many different versions of that. It became less about, my gosh, we're going to kill her. But we knew that my limit was very high, and we can talk about how and why that is. It's probably a whole other podcast in itself. But you would know if you had a client with a similar goal that was, off the couch to 5K, the hit or limit would be really different. But it's kind of applying a similar philosophy. And I think that's really important because as a society, we often aren't pushed enough, right? Very few folks want to feel uncomfortable or feel under stress. But it's a good way in terms of when you're really at that peak and striving toward unlocking the next gear. You almost have to go through that. And, I'm grateful that we could do it and I didn't die.
Yeah, exactly.
You kind of brought up some memories. I forgot about some of those sessions.
And that's the element of personalization too, and having that personal approach to each of these things. I just want to pivot back a little bit to the injury. So how did injury specifically change the way you plan and made decisions? Hey, thanks for listening to the episode. Sorry to interrupt. Just wanted to remind you that you got discounts for Trainerize, Bioptimizers, Whoop, and ATP Labs in the show notes. Okay, back to the episode.
Yeah, I think all those points that, we always think the bullet to kill us has not been made. And injury forces you to kind of stop in your tracks because you're just physically not able to do something. And so I've been through three kind of big injuries. Two, just were more psychological setbacks. If anything, one was a broken foot. I had shattered my fifth metatarsal. And then, kind of gotten over that. And that was very, very humbling when something small and, kind of in an x-ray scan, really has huge impacts on your body mechanics, especially as a rower. It took quite a long time and had impacts on my hip alignment, just in terms of mechanical movement, and, caused other kind of challenges that was making anything across the posterior chain really, really challenging, but kind of came that and moved on. And then I think the shoulder injury was just kind of a freak accident, running and tripping on the sidewalk. I wish it was a better story, but, it kind of, hurt kind of my subscap and broke off the tip of my glenoid, which looks, again, really small, but took quite a long time to recover. So, but I think what it forces you to do is go back to the main point around awareness, be very aware of the limits of your body and focusing on other areas that often go neglected. So around just basic movement on how you can take load. And I think back to some of the exercises that we did where I think I had broken my shoulder end of September. Yeah, that we got in touch in November and nationals was February. And I said, Joe, that we're going to podium. And, you have a pretty good poker face, but you're like, well, we'll see what we can do. But we had a plan. And it was actually really, really interesting to see kind of how we did that. So I think if anything, it brought a bit of humility and brought me back to basics, which is not a bad thing in all training programs to go back to recalibrate. But I think that was something I continue to learn and not take anything for granted, especially as I age and still continue to compete in different avenues.
Yeah. I hear Stanley in the background.
Yeah, he wants to contribute. He's Sarah looking at me at the corner. Stanley, shh.
That's okay. Yeah, and I think, another good story just to bring up.
Joe, hang on for 2 seconds.
Yeah.
I'm just going to go and get him a treat so he doesn't be annoying. Hang on.
Yeah, no problem. I'll tell the story while you get the treat. So the commitment to recovery, I think, is another good story worth telling. And Charlotte will touch on this as we come back into it. But or I'll wait for her to come back.
Sorry.
Yeah, that's okay.
Back from his run, and he's also high performing, and he's there. I'm starving. Feed me.
All good. The story I was just going to bring up is just also your commitment to recovery was a big thing too. I believe you saran wrapped your arm to your body for a few days or weeks to make sure that you weren't re-injuring or re-aggravating the shoulder. So that's kind of when I met you was after that, and you came in and we were chatting, and you're like, I broke my shoulder, and I was like, okay, when was that? And you're like, 6 weeks ago. I'm like, okay. How are you moving right now? And you're like, well, I saran wrapped my arm to my body so I could heal faster.
Yeah, I was so committed, right? Because I think part of it is, And this is where it's always interesting when you think about a non-active person versus an active person, that you take so many things for granted, and injuries happen. I have a lot of friends now slipping, like it's so cold and icy, hurting their knees, tearing their ACL or MCL. They're not particularly athletic. They're not competitive at all, but just activities like daily life, running around here, doing stuff that you're kind of at a lockstep, like you can't do anything. And so for me, it was really important that I really wanted to not, like, competing aside, it was good to have a goal that kind of forced me into submission. But it was being aware and mindful, that when we started training, I knew that you would have a lot of pressure on yourself to help me get it in the best shape I could and back to be able to compete. It was also that some of the injury that we had, I was able to still move kind of along, like the same plane. So rowing, doing this was different, that I didn't have to do this with my shoulders. I was able to kind of get back on and start movement. But I know before, when we were training, I think 1.5 days a week in the morning, because I couldn't do a ton of cardio, I would come in for an hour and a half before, just for my mobility and fear of arthritis, to do all the shoulder rehab. And that, so that by the time I got to see you and we'd start a lift, which sometimes was just body weight and doing stuff, like I was drenched, dripping. Like I remember us sitting there and you're like, today's a big day. We have the safety bar. We can do a squat. And like, there's no weight on it. And you're like, I don't want you to get injured. And I was dying. But very quickly, with all that baseline, it's like making those deposits. Every week, there was a point where we kept getting up, and within I think I was squatting with weight in December. January was like, what injury? And by February, I was back in pre-injury shape and all full range of motion. So that commitment was another signal and a humbling reminder that, injury or not, we should be investing when you're putting that much load on your body. And that recovery approach is really important.
Yeah, and rebuilding safely.
Yeah.
What did the period teach you about waiting for perfect conditions versus working with what you had?
Oh my gosh, such a good question. It's like you were listening to my team meeting earlier this week. I was saying to them, and it's kind of the approach I have with training. Am I going to be kind of on time? As we know, we're always working against the clock and work back from a goal. Am I okay with 70% kind of complete or perfect to meet the goal, or late and perfect? And I'm always in the mind of nothing's ever going to be perfect. I think, you and I would always debrief after our main lifts at the end of the week and do a retrospective after every competition. There's always going to be margin of improvement. Even gold medal Olympians will say they could have done stuff that's different. And so I think with me, it's always looking at what the signals tell. Now I'm that confidence and judgment to know how that gap's there, how I can get more confident in closing it. Is I feel a lot more confident going into it, but also too, there's areas where I'm actually okay having a gap, because I know the marginal benefit to increase, if I add so much more load, and in my head, it sounds nuts, but I'm like, hey, if I put 2 more hours into this for is a fraction of a second going to make that much of a material difference. And I think that that's just through training experience, and especially when you're competing, that you get better at. As a recent example, I got down when I was training for High Rocks. I did 3 races this past year. I did doubles open women with 2 different female training partners I had. And then I did singles, so open. Very different race, very different approach, different load on the body, etc. But with the doubles race, when I've done trials in that, gotten pretty good to know kind of what the effort and input is and what kind of output I'm going to get. And that's just something as a good example that it's not the data on the page, it's the feeling. So I know if I'm waking up, depending on the time of the month, when I'm where I am at in my cycle, if I've kind of been really bad with my sleep or been out and had a couple drinks the night before, which never do before you do a High Rocks time trial, it's not a good output, let me tell you. But I kind of know the ingredients to fueling, etc. of here's when I'm going to do this, and I know I'm going to get a really good output. And then there's the element of surprise, right? And so I'd gone and done a fun time trial, didn't even really think anything of it. It was for fun. I probably got some of the best times I've ever gotten, and it's because I wasn't tracking the data. I was just going by feeling. So I forgot to charge my watch. But then after, when I got the anklet back, I was actually surprised. And so part of that, I think, was great in the moment, but it also, because I had that benchmark now, all my other training, it was a different level, which I think kind of played into when I competed on my own. I had almost too much information to know every lap, everything there. It didn't allow me to truly enjoy the race, but importantly, feel the type of performance and squeeze I needed to give at different pieces of the race. And so this is something I think is really important as we're kind of looking at, like to answer your question around kind of what is your approach or philosophy going to be going into a training or like a specific race.
What's kind of interesting with that too is almost that the technology fills in a gap where experience hasn't occurred. So if you've prepped for a lot of competitions, you start to understand, first of all, like how much work needs to go in to get a great result, and when you do more work, how little or worsened the result is by trying to do more all the time, and actually narrowing down and finding like what's sort of the sweet spot of not too little, sort of Goldilocks of training and preparation. And not to a point where you're like burning yourself out just trying to do more for the sake of more. And I think probably what a lot of people are using tracking devices for is to close the gap on the experience.
Yeah. And I think sometimes what it can do, I mean, look, we need to get data and metrics to know baseline of where you're at. But it's almost like the same when I've had friends that are looking to lose the last like 5 pounds or weighing themselves in the morning and at night, maybe throughout the day. At some point, too much data is giving a bad signal. And so I look at it, practical example, when I was training to do the 24-hour row, I had a high volume. It was like over 150 kilometers a week of rowing that I cumulatively would have to build, similar to an approach that a marathon runner would take just to get the volume in and train up the pyramid. But I also had the volume of training for us doing all our strength, plus all the other planning and race prep. So there's just a lot of stuff going on, and your brain doesn't know the difference in these signals. It's just stress. So I really had to take a different approach. And what I found is there's 2 things that were really kind of a game changer that didn't have to do with my Apple Watch or anything tracking on paper. One was just training by feeling. So when I would row, I would often row with a blindfold on. I wouldn't look at the screen. I would just go by feeling. And this is where I'd be sitting on the erg for like 4 hours after work, listening to a podcast, being with my own thoughts. And if you had told me as a sprinter that I would have been doing that, I would have said you were nuts, because erging is boring. You're just kind of looking at a screen. And so when I used to go up into like, John and Richmond at Good Life, I'd be locked in the PT room in the rower. People would come in and out with their clients, and people would say hi, but it just kind of got me into the habit. I looked at the data after because I wanted to just feel the experience of like, what did it feel when you were tired? What did it feel like when you were bored? Like, how did your legs feel? And just giving yourself little cues every couple of minutes. And it made the time pass. I think the other thing that was super helpful is when you're tired or when you're mentally just feeling like uninterested, just don't train. And I know that's counterintuitive, where when people are paying for training, it's this like, of course, like you wouldn't want me saying that 5 minutes before we were going into a session. But I think we still spent time together, but that time could look a bit different. So it meant, you had a really, amazing workout plan. I'm like, Joe, I'm just not feeling it. I need something else. That time still clocked as input. And so I find that like really listening to yourself and the signals, actually that those are the weeks where I saw performance and outcome peak, which was important. And I think at least in rowing Canada community, and like when I taught at the Argos a couple of summers ago, we were kind of testing out the philosophy. So this high volume, firing at all cylinders, peak constantly is actually not healthy physiologically, if not mentally. And so there's a very different approach now in junior athlete development. And I think the approach to doing these races now, which is really, really great for safe sport, but also too, it's like, I think you're going to get a lot more potential out of athletes that you typically wouldn't have performed as well with past methods.
Yeah. And the concept is kind of, it's on a weekly or even daily scale, but the maybe more common example of that is like tapering for a race. And this would be where it could be any sport, weightlifting included in this, where you take the last 1 to 2 weeks of, basically no volume, sort of maybe some maintenance lifts, just to where you're feeling good, make sure your joints feel good going into it. And usually what you get out of that, if the taper is done properly, is you get a really energized, slightly antsy, excited to compete athlete. For you, that was like, a real itchy time where you're like, I need to do something. I'm like, no, you can't do anything, because what you need to do is build the interest and excitement in doing the hard thing. And you see that with any athlete who works out the day before a game versus doesn't work out a few days before, works out super light a couple days before. All of a sudden they've got this boost of energy going into their sport, and that goes also for the psychological side of things, is that it's not just how you physically feel tired or energized. Mentally, if you are not energized to compete in the sport, you're not going to have good results, and that's usually the burnout effect for athletes. Is I've been doing this so much, I'm tired of doing it, and when it comes to competition, it's just more of the same stuff, and I don't want to do that anymore. You need breaks.
Exactly. And you find folks that, like, I'm sure that you come across them, or folks who that are listening to you on this podcast. Like, we get folks who have it's part of, they probably even learned to skate before they learn how to brush their teeth or take care of themselves. They suddenly retire, get injured out of a sport, and really that identity, a piece of them is gone. And so for me, that's, it's personal choice. And I know everyone has different reasons for when they hang up their skates or skis or, oars. But for me, that was such a big part of my life. I wanted to have it reincorporated, but in a different way. I also think sometimes when training becomes work, and it's for a lot of us, it was like part of felt like a job, if not, it was a job. That there's kind of a negative reinforcement there. And so when you're not performing, you get hit with not coaching, that you get hit with more work. So there's sometimes a negative relationship formed. And frankly, I see that with my teams at work, which leads to, I'm sure that you see it with your clients. When you have so much outputs to track, there's a lot of pressure and stress to hit an outcome. And unlike, maybe at a race for me, if you ever lose at a rowing race, you have to row past everyone who's on the podium, and rowing, when you're last, because there's no one in front of you, you're crossing the finish line last. So talk about that for a bit of a mental trip.
Right.
But I think this is where we're seeing high degrees of burnout, disengagement, or bad decisions, frankly, that have really big impacts beyond just not getting a medal at a podium. And so I think some of these things there's a greater degree of accountability on the athlete side to really take accountability for the awareness of human signals of what's going on in here and in here, which as a coach, you could be an observer, but you're also not a mind reader. And so these things I think are going to be really important moving forward, especially when, we have so much impact, mental health is such an impact on physical health and performance, whether it's in sport or even I'm seeing it, in my day-to-day with the teams I manage.
Mm-hmm. How do you sort of distill down which data you like to pay attention to and which data you can omit?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there's two things now boiled down to. I think there's data that I have to look at to build awareness as the data is changing a lot. So what we have access to today, if say you and I were training against the same outcome, would have been different than the data we had access to before. And that's just different ways of collection, right? And so I think for me, there's certain things I know just from a safety perspective, paying attention to the metrics are going to be really important. And so, as a current example, after COVID, I developed long COVID. I didn't know at the time it was long COVID, but the data was there. My O2 sat was under 80, which anyone listening in healthcare is going to freak out when they hear that. And there's other physical things, I couldn't walk my dog around the block. I was coughing thousands of times a day. I could feel the scar tissue, even to the point where my lungs here were so inflamed. I had a bump. So there were things that I think would be you'd be remiss and it'd be dangerous to ignore. And so I think that's important, whatever the training protocol or regimen is. As a coach now, there's so much more responsibility and accountability for how you're giving up training protocols. So that's really important. I think some of the things that are kind of newer are just the signals. It's the mental health side. It's the judgment. So how are people thinking and feeling? What are the patterns of behavior that you could start to pick up when someone can't articulate how they're feeling? They don't know what they don't know or need. That's the judgment and expertise, I think, that is so important and valuable from a coaching perspective. You knew when I was tired, that we knew each other so well, that you knew when there was things going on personally where you would just make the decision, because when I came in to see you, you were the boss. I wasn't Charlotte in the boardroom. I was your client. And so I entrusted that this decision-making power for you. And that's something I think is really important, that trusted relationship. It's those other signals that are more personal, that you created space for that and knew the questions to ask, that I would feel open to share. Like, hey, yesterday I had a really bad day. I got into a fight with a friend of mine. I didn't only slept 5 hours. I didn't want to bail on you, but I'm showing up. I'm not able to push myself through, but can we modify and do something else? And, I'm still going to do my share. But right now in this moment, this is what I need.
Yeah, I think one thing for you, there's a few things I want to circle back on, but one thing for you was that you are very open to and very communicative to let me know that type of scenario, and we built enough rapport that you would give me that kind of information, but secretly I would know before you had said anything.
Really?
Because when you spend that much time with someone, you start to pick up, and when you're looking for specific things and asking specific questions, you start to pick up on like body language, how you answer a question, where you put your bag when you walk in, how your shoes are one sock higher than the other, whatever. You start to look for those signals, and you can tell when someone is, or you can learn to tell when someone is in the right state of mind to push and when they're not in the right state of mind and they need an alternative on that day. But that's where having someone in your corner is really helpful, because you're not always aware of all your own signals. It's helpful if someone else can pick up on some of those signals too.
I think it's good. And I think that this is where, like, I know we would often, in many of our conversations, like hours and hours and hours, like it was the time in between sets when I was like probably recovering of almost dying and heart rate was dropping down. This is where I think it's so, powerful to look at, like, and you probably see this a lot with your clients. Often this is the person that you see more than your doctor, your friends, maybe your partner or spouse, that's picking up on all these other signals and information that's not captured in Whoop or your Fitbit or all this other stuff. Yeah. And I think it's a really powerful spot to be in when we look at broader, like the implications of, as people are trying to, like, there's one thing training for a high performance sport, but just most people are coming saying, just help me be healthy. I want to not die early. I want to be able to have a high quality of life as I get into older age or pick up my grandchildren. Like, these are things that I think are becoming more real. And I think what's interesting is that you can use all these things as a feedback tool, but it's still not going to replace the decision making. Like, we probably made together hundreds of decisions in light of some of the data, but it's not like the data and the watches and the tracking sheets and all that made the decision on behalf. There was still that judgment element. And that's where I think that these relationships are so important. And I hope a lot of your fellow coaches in that have the experience to work with clients, even hitting goals like getting in shape for the first time, getting off some of their medication or reducing it to live a better quality of life, because these are all philosophies and principles I think that apply really broadly and not just to competitive athletes.
Yeah, and I also would say too that the data and information, a lot of people know what they need to do, and some of these devices now can tell you what you need to do, but ultimately it does come down to decision making. It also comes down to consistency and coaching and getting someone into a position where they can actually start to make some of those decisions for themselves. Sometimes their stress loads are so high and their routines are so locked in that they don't have room to make new decisions. So you sort of need someone guiding certain scenarios. Let's circle back to the long COVID stuff, because that is kind of an example, I would say, of like reverse signal recognition, where you're going in to these offices and telling them, something's off. I know something's off. I know myself well enough that I'm not where I'm supposed to be. And they're looking at the data that they have in front of them and suggesting the opposite, not using feeling and feedback and personal understanding to make a better decision. So can you dive in a little bit on that? Does that make sense, that it was like almost a reverse of that?
Yeah. And that's what it was like. It was almost like, it felt like a mind game, right? I was to the point where I convinced myself, maybe they're right. And I feel like so many people I've met, unfortunately have had, whether themselves or a family member, where you're struggling to find an answer. And I think it's tough when, just goes back to like our healthcare system, the challenge, like there's a gap, right? Because we're at a time we have all this data and information. We don't have access to know what to do with it all the time, or in terms of how individuals are interpreting the data. to give you advice or to help you, it's not always like the same, because like we're dealing with sometimes new information that no one's actually had to deal with before. And I think the long COVID example is a good one.
Yeah.
And I present well. So I would go to the doctor, they would see my background. They would say, well, that you can't possibly fit into the bucket of being sick or ill, especially when I'm able to articulate how I'm feeling, what I'm thinking it is, bringing them information. And I think a lot of it turned out to like, you have to be your own advocate. You have to be aware of your body. It's that awareness that goes outside of like, here's what the numbers are saying, but if it's not adding up, what does that look like? Like they had asked me, they said, you're fitting the prognosis of someone who is a heavy smoker or vapor. Your lungs are permanently scarred. Like I now have asthma for the rest of my life, which is wild to me because I've never even smoked a cigarette in my life. Like I don't vape it or anything. But on top of it was the metrics of how, even with the healthiest baseline out of so many people, how it impacted me. I couldn't go but think about, well, what if I had compromised my health and this had hit me on top of having a chronic health condition, or maybe I was a chronic smoker or right? And so these are things that was just, again, a bit of a wake up call around, especially now that I'm aging, even though I hate to say it, Joe, I'm aging. I don't know what happened in 10 years, but it was important. The lesson learned for me was, you have to know your body. You have to be your own advocate. And how do you invest today so that when you're hit with potentially something, which we all, will be at some point in our life, hopefully not super serious, we have the baseline to fight it off. Because, once they unlocked that and figured it out, and getting I had the right doctor who listened, who was trusted, we problem solved it, was able to figure out oh, you just need a proper steroid protocol to reduce the inflammation. Oh, some of these signals that others are reading are not correct. Oh, you've applied the right judgment and we can work together on a plan. I was able to walk the dog. I was able to do high rocks again. I was able to check off and say, no, I don't have lung cancer. No, I wasn't a smoker. No, all these things that were very serious and very scary. But it was a long journey to get there. Even someone who's very confident and was able to advocate. And so I think that these things are important. If anyone you're working with, or you see this in your practice with some of your clients, to encourage them to advocate, but have that awareness to know what those signals are, because the doctors are not magicians. They're just going through a checklist.
Yeah, it's a good point to bring up too, in terms of the making sure that you are in front of the right people too, and asking the right questions. You're sitting in front of the, every specialist that you go see has a specific toolbox, and that toolbox may not be applicable to the thing that you're in front of them for. So to be able to go and get, quote unquote, a second opinion, or ask questions differently, or find a different person, it ties to the sort of AI conversation that we're having, where, the AI isn't incorrect. You just asked the question poorly, or could be asked differently. It's sort of the same idea, but their specialist toolbox is it's limited to only what they know. So that's where you have to do a bit of deep dive and digging in to find out who should I actually be talking to really help me out with this. And like you said, as soon as you got with the right person, all of a sudden, things turned around quite quickly. But I've run into lots of examples of this, but even for yourself, if you remember, when you go do a physical, every time they tell you, oh, we got to do more assessments on your heart because your heart rate is so low, and I remember you telling me that was something you had to advocate for yourself on the healthy side of things. Was no, I don't need to go do more heart rate testing and things like that, because I know what my baseline is.
Correct. And that's where I think it's something where I'm always a proponent of all my family's in healthcare. My mom's a nurse, my cousins are nurses. I'm probably the only one out there you work in technology, you don't count. And I say that kind of a joking way, but I grew up in a family of healthcare believing in the public system. And I think seeing, and I still believe in it, but I realize now, because we have all this information, I still have to be on top of my stuff and know when I'm going in to do my yearly physicals. It's easy if someone's presenting well and fit, doesn't look like they have any issues, all the baseline data is there, but the devil's in the details. And I always kind of take the right time to ask my doctor, now that I finally was able to get one, which was a whole other process. I didn't have a consistent family doctor for quite a long time. Having a really clear idea of here's my baseline, and being able to articulate and get a little bit more educated around what's in my genetic makeup, what's in my background. Like, I've invested doing genetic testing. I've invested doing private MRIs because there was so much stuff going on. I wanted to make sure, was there a hidden issue that I didn't want to wait to have find just due to the backlog in the public system, and really looking at that and getting the right care practitioner to say, what are things moving forward that I can and cannot do? So the heart rate example is a good one. Like, genetically, it's someone, in my entire family, everyone has very low blood pressure and low heart rate. Like, my resting heart rate is 39.
And your dad's.
Wake up at morning, it's like 32, 34. And so I have to be very careful when I get up. I'm dehydrated in that because, that you can faint. And so, but knowing that has been really important, not only for training, which is great to game it and do these high performance, sports. So I feel like genetically gifted in that aspect. But even things when I've had to go in and do like minor procedures and surgery to tell the anesthesiologist, like, got to be careful how much anesthetic you give me because here's my resting heart rate and here's why. And so I think that these all things are like powerful, but again, it's the judgment, right? And so I'm a nerd about this stuff. I love to do all the tests in that, but there's also a limit where I think one of them, like this pulmonary doctor who helped me with the long COVID said, you also have to remember it's also a judgment and an opinion from the medical field. And so sometimes if you go looking for a problem, you will find it, which anyone who's gone through a lot of testing, even if you think the physical training, whenever you go in to do personal training or anything, everyone fails that. There's always a margin of improvement you can have. And so it's a matter of thinking, well, what's going to be good enough and where's the improvement that's going to help me live a long life, but catch things that are truly critical versus nice to have.
Yeah, another example of that too is disc degeneration. You may have no symptoms operating, your body's operating perfectly fine. If you go and look at the most spines, there is disc degeneration. Like 90% of people will have that. So if you could go looking for it, you're going to find it. That's where data probably is. It has a ceiling in terms of how much you need to know and how deeply you need to dive into things. Tying it into now, working directly with AI in a sort of leadership and governance position, where do you see AI genuinely improving human performance, and where does it clearly fall short?
It's a good question. If I had the perfect answer, we would be able to crack the code on this. I think
today we're solving this problem.
Yeah, I know. So I think it's an exciting time, right? So I started working in AI in 2016, so almost a decade ago, when it was just really in its research stages. So the governments were using it, private corporations were using it or experimenting, but from a general public, it wasn't really kind of applicable yet. We didn't see it kind of working for us. We didn't have chat, GPT, et cetera. And then you kind of saw in 2017 this big explosion where people were able to start prompting to generate text, images, sound. And now it's taken off with agents and, all the fraudulent and stuff where people are, I see more AI videos about these poor dogs in humane societies or things that I had to always say, is that real or not? Or is that AI? I think what AI is doing is it's sharpening the data to make it, to really assess what is good or bad data. And so there are a lot of tools where we can really very quickly understand what is real or fake. And so really good example of this, especially in the research field. So for medical research, when you're looking at treatments and care and making things more accessible, this has been really important because in Canada, healthcare and health services are public. So they're paid by the government, aka our tax dollars. So as we're able to, the technology is like spiking, things are more accessible and cheaper. It's actually helping researchers to get to better insights and outcome faster because we have ways and tools to actually be able to tell us what is good or bad data and use it to generate really good insights. I think where I see it, the shortcomings are that one, we're running out of good data, which sounds wild. If you look at the amount of data available in the world, and if you look at, if you're really nerdy and follow, like there's Human Plus Machine and other books that start outline kind of this revolution or, next generation or revolution of work. What we're kind of seeing though, is that for us to get better insights and get better outcomes, we obviously need more data to train. But what's happening is that everyone's using AI. I'm sure you're using it, whether you know it or not. Some of it's behind the scenes, some of it's active. what's happening is, in order to fuel and feed these new solutions, our developers and companies are often having to use training data or synthetic or made up data because people are becoming more aware about giving over their data. They don't want it used for marketing or commercial purposes. And so if you really want to see a practical example of this, if you bought the new Garmin or Apple Watch, there's a massive user agreement. You probably skim through it, click accept, and you don't care. But it actually talks about very intentional ways they're using your health data, that they're aggregating it for, commercial purposes, insurance companies, others. And so consumers are becoming a lot more aware and saying, no, I don't want you to use my data, or I want flexibility to use it on my terms. So that's impacting the quality. So what that means is that judgment is still going to have a gap. You're not going to get the best judgment all the time. You're going to get something called hallucination. So you go into ChatGPT and you say, make me a training plan. I want to do high rocks and get on the podium in 12 weeks. Yeah, you'll get a program. But for the average, person or athlete going in, if you don't have the background, you don't have all the judgment there, you aren't able to necessarily discern with great confidence if that's a good or a bad plan. It's not going to know your genetic background. It's not going to know your training history. Sure, you could feed it, but it has a greater propensity to hallucinate, because in the background, what would be, say, you and I creating a plan together, me feeding you insights, you and I chatting and iterating, you're having a set of math or algorithms kind of do the work. And what they're drawing upon is any publicly available training plans that anyone has posted to form a judgment. You better hope that judgment's good, but that judgment doesn't know you as a person. And so it's a good example around, we can't just rely on that stuff. It's like guidance to help with creativity. But I still think there's a lack of judgment there due to incomplete data, insufficient volume, or incorrect data. And that's where you're still getting a bit of a gap in terms of building that trust and confidence in some of the outputs.
Yeah, especially because it's basically a large language model. It's pulling any and all information from any and all sources that it has access to. And so that also includes, if some Joe Schmo has written a blog about High Rocks training and all their information is incorrect, it can pull data from that, and that is where the lack of accuracy leaks into the information that it's spitting back out.
100%. And so even with that too, you have some protocols, say, as an example, okay, we have a file folder, which is like our data lake. And we say, someone could say, well, Joe and Charlotte, what if I only fed a data that I trusted? Fine. But you're only limited to whatever data you have available. So you might say, okay, when I'm putting together programs for clients who want to say that 12-week High Rocks training program example, you have a certain bias. Doesn't mean it's bad. It's a bias around your training philosophy, your approach, the balance against kind of some of those tracks. So you're going to be very intentional with what you feed the model. You would maybe ask, an old school trainer I worked with when I was first started to compete, very different philosophy around volume, around load, around pace. So, that's going to be really important, because when you generate that output, there's going to be a bias on who collected the data, who developed the model. And I can tell you, even with my developer team, there's a whole school thought around this responsible AI usage. That diversity of thinking and experience is really important, because even a lot of the developers now have been going to school with a similar approach, trained a certain way. So how they're architecting and building these solutions, you don't have a lot of creativity all the time. And so these are things, when we're putting so much trust in someone else or a robot to make these decisions, we have to apply a bit of judgment, or give a bit of leeway that it's not going to be primed or have judgment that's going to lie with our values and philosophy around training, or in a medical sense around people are Googling, how do I treat my heart condition? I probably say that that's not a good avenue to use AI for.
Do you think that, or have you seen that, because in that scenario where you're trying to kind of create confinements around where the information is coming from, that because it's limited, it also maybe highlights biases?
Sometimes I think that you'd have to be pretty confident, let me put it this way. One, it's the data you use and the input that you get is only as good as your judgment. So you're at a point in your career where you've trained so many different clients. You've looked at different training systems. You are well-read. You also make it a mission to continue to upskill yourself and, learn new methods. You also have the experience to see what what bad looks like. So you've also seen the lessons learned about here's where I didn't, maybe myself, a reflection, I didn't apply the right philosophy, and here is the gaps or the goops I made, or others in industry as you guys continue to get together, and this is the ongoing skilling and up training. I think that that's something really important to look at. I look at AI in simplest terms as like a very smart intern. So if you think about someone or a co-op student early in their career, it's only as good as you train it, right? So if you're not a good coach or a good trainer, the AI is not going to be good. It's not smart. It's just going to learn and self-learn based on the basis or foundation of the method, the approach, the data. Now, if you're a really, really good, sophisticated data scientist or coach or trainer that has lots of experience and knows how to manipulate and use the data to align with your values, I think that's a good first step. But it comes down to what you kind of talked about. This is a large language model or an LLM. How that reinforcement or self-learning happens is when people get very uncomfortable, because at some point, the technology's evolved that you're not going to have to train this algorithm anymore, right? It will self-learn. It will start like an intern. It grows into an employee and grows into a senior leader. This person or algorithm will continue to learn and make independent judgments. And it's that unsupervised learning is where people get uncomfortable. And this is where you have some bad outputs or outcomes sometimes when the model decides to go and do its own thing that isn't ethical, isn't safe, and yet, someone trusts the outputs and doesn't know how to check, or there's not that explainability about why this outcome is good or why this outcome is bad. And this is where we've seen a lot of examples. I'm sure people here can pull upon where they've seen like the Tesla car crash, or, the chatbots. I know Air Canada had a chatbot that kind of gave out some bad advice, or a concert I went to over the summer. The TTC had its own bot and people didn't know it was AI. It was telling people to go home from a Coldplay concert to the wrong avenue that was in the middle of the field. That was very unsafe. So these are just some answers. It's not making a comment that their data science teams are bad or they had a malicious intent. We're also learning with very new experimental tech that isn't perfect.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's so new, then it's upscaling so quickly that it's hard to really predict what it's going to do. I've sort of heard this. The best example maybe is like human AI human. Like you can feed it, but you have to have an expert on the other end who can decipher whether it is correct or not before sending it out.
Yeah, and this is where I think there's some of the research. If you go to if you ever I know, we had talked about, how product gets built. So forget AI, but really the approach, we want things to be customer centric or human centric. So when we build something, if we don't think about people or humans in the loop, then it just becomes a science project, testing if something can return a response or not. When you start putting humans at the center of that, then it's like, well, it's not that the answer is yes or no, but is the answer acceptable? Does someone really like the answer? Does it satisfy a need? And I think, we're breaking it down in really, really tiny pieces, but this is something that you as a coach and trainer do all the time, right? Like you're designing a program that's fit for, hey, it's not just like go and do these squats or these, these curls, etc. But is this going to actually, is Charlotte going to enjoy doing this? Is this going to not only help her meet her goals, but are we going to actually establish a good rapport? It's that other stuff that's really important so that it's centered to me versus another client may have the same goal, but the approach or to get there, this nuances would not be acceptable to that person. It wouldn't be a program that would really kind of align.
So there's maybe a good follow-up question to this is, where do people over-delegate responsibility to systems?
I think where there's so much trust that they don't go and check the results, where it's thinking, I'm going to automate, or this expectation that AI is going to take away work and we're going to work an hour a week and the robots are going to do our work for us. Like, I mean, I wish it was like that, but I also think part of what makes us human and drives things like self-esteem and that we get from our jobs around having satisfaction, like AI and having all like the Garmin's and the Apple Watches couldn't replicate us kind of calling and being really emotional, being, oh my God, Joe, I got the world record. I can't do that, right? Otherwise that we wouldn't, I think this is part of what makes us human, is to actually learn, kind of grow together and have those very emotional experiences around succeeding and achieving goals or not achieving goals, and understanding, okay, well, why? Where could we improve? What could be done differently? And that's kind of that whole process that I think that you grow and evolve and get, at least for me, there's a high degree of satisfaction. And with my clients that I work with, when we're solving these complex things that are helping align, what is the future of this company? And the future of how their team is learning and working or doing things differently or solving a really big problem that could impact a lot of customers or citizens. Like there's some of that stuff just because we could automate it, like should we? Right. And I think that that's the judgment. And I think as Canadians, we're very risk averse. We want to be very cautious and careful. We don't want to do things that others, unless we learn from others' mistakes. And we see that, politically, we see that in our policies. In other parts of the world, it's a very different philosophy around, say, work or use of data or the process they take working with this technology. And I think this is why even more so people have to ask questions and, like, as I said, advocate for themselves, whether it's in a health situation, but also know how their information is getting used and be very invested to co-develop those goals and those solutions so that they have a greater degree of visibility into how that process is working, but also too can feel part of the outcome and not just handed the outcome.
It made me think of the example of, I think it was Albania who chose an AI minister, and there was a massive, uproar to that, a huge negative response because people don't want a bot or whatever to be making decisions that directly impact human beings because there may not be the nuance of safety or future planning or consideration of things that have happened in the past, right? It's going to be very black and white, very binary in its decision making, and that's probably not always a good idea to go that route.
No, and I think this is what makes us human, right? So I think we're at a critical point, and I was talking with a colleague the other day whose whole family, unlike my family in healthcare, that her whole family is in education and teaching, and said that a study came out around the state of education because unlike when we were going to school, there's like I had overhead projectors. I was still like, there was no computers. There was one computer or two in a lab. We were doing things manually. There was a lot of play. It was a very different world than now the kids coming up through elementary school and high school around the reliance on technology, always on phones, this whole other world we're seeing with like people posting and kids on, Snapchat, et cetera. It's a very different communication style. We've actually modified our communication. But what's an interesting coming out of this study is they said it's the first time in North America that, if we look back to our parents' and grandparents' generation, every generation got smarter and more knowledgeable, where we got out of like factory working to more of a split with more strategic work. And now there's like, a whole other range of jobs. It's the first time with this new up and coming generation where we actually have an advanced kind of intellectually because of the over-reliance on technology to the point where, I've said to them, is there going to be a decision with the school boards to actually change the curriculum, like make it harder, remove some of the tech and digital classrooms? And she said, no, they've actually been asked to, in some cases, modify curriculum because you can't fail kids for social and mental health reasons. But also, too, it's so that kids can meet them where they're at because they're not able to meet all the curriculum objectives all the time. And I think that's really important because we can debate why and how, and there's a political angle there, and there's a whole bunch of other factors. But I think if we say from a philosophy perspective and a values, now this is the other end where are we over relying on technology to save the day or to replace things that actually were really important that should be done manually? Like I look at a silly example, but when you go to get your hair cut, they have these pilots now in Dubai in the Middle East where you can go and stick your head in a machine and get a cut. Well, there's no way I would ever trust that. Like, how I like my long hair, but like I look forward to seeing my hairdresser every quarter. We have a conversation and we've known her for 10 years and my texture and all that stuff. Like that's something that I think even if we could automate it, maybe it's a better job. I wouldn't want to, right? And then we're erasing a whole sector of society that does service level work. Like what are these people going to do? Maybe that's like an artistry. So it's a very interesting point in time. And I think there's a lot of, I know I was at some of the conferences like CanFit and others, and they're talking about the future of training and what is that going to look like in coaching where we have so much tech available. Is it going to disrupt in a way that makes sense? And I think the jury's still out.
Yeah, with the fitness stuff specifically too. I remember when the mirror trainer system came out, and someone asked me like, "Aren't you concerned that's going to start to take clients away from you. And I kind of chuckled a little bit. And I think it's mostly like I've been in now for about 10 years, and I've seen enough trends come and go. So for people who've been in this industry for more, 25 years, 30 years, they've seen these sort of blips of technology come in and sort of disrupt for a few minutes, and then they tend to disappear because ultimately, like the hairdresser, it comes down to the high touch relationship that you need to have that, because you stick your head in the thing and it cuts your hair, great, gives you a decent haircut, but maybe in that scenario you needed to have a conversation with your hairdresser about like, what style do I want to be wearing for the next 5 years? And there's an interaction that is way more personal to start to figure out, like, maybe we should go short for a little while. And you're like, no, I don't want to go short. I like my long hair. So let's, leave it alone.
Yeah.
But those relationships need to exist. Otherwise, especially there are very specific things that high touch and high interaction will probably never be replaced for those reasons.
Yeah. And I think from a fitness perspective, it's interesting. So just this past year, I joined the board of directors for Participaction, which is the only national nonprofit that its full mandate is to get people moving and active and keep them healthy, and supports a lot of more regional or provincial. The one piece of data that they put out, a report every year, it's really helpful. It's the report on Canada's fitness and wellness. So they do a report card across Canada. And it's interesting because when all these like fitness apps were coming out, the Nike training app, it came out, there was so much fear. I remember being at Kent and everyone's like, oh, training's going to come to a halt and we need to hold our clients close and do stuff. And I said, it's never going to happen. And what's interesting is, to your point, if you read the report card, it has a lot of good data in there. We've actually gotten, like, obesity is still very high. We've actually, chronic heart disease and visits to the ER, all the metrics where they used to track if the provinces and country is healthy. Even in light of all this tech, people are still unhealthy. And in some areas the trends are not improving. And so I think even though all this is out there, the one thing that you cannot solve for is the motivation, what it takes to motivate folks to get active, to do all the things that they say they're going to do. Technology is not going to do the work for you. You still have to put the work in. And this is what I use with some of my clients. So to say, you can have the money, you can have the time, but if you don't have the willpower and the right support, change will not happen. And so these things are all helpers. They're accelerators. They surface, things that are helpful when you're in a relationship, in coaching relationship, looking to make improvements. People can use them as a crutch, but they're not going to replace the need that, like, when I look at our situation, I still have to put the work in. I still have to show up and put the effort in. Even if I did the program, you saw me for a couple hours a week. I had how many hours? Like 1 hour a day you saw me. I still had 23 to mess it all up and not sleep and eat like garbage and not follow my other plan. So there's limits to really what this can do. And if anything, I think these apps, like even Peloton now, and the Peloton app, it's never going to replace training. It's actually opening up areas of the population that don't have access to get people moving and even have the intent to start to commit to doing something, which, if anything, is not a bad thing. There's something for everyone.
I'm sure there's a great quote out there. I'm going to paraphrase what I don't know and say, technology still needs a user. A Peloton bike that is not turned on by a person and sat on and pedaled is a useless piece of equipment. Or, ChatGPT is only a great tool if someone gives it a prompt. It still needs the human interaction for it to work. And just like, technology for what we're wearing to, improve movement, you still have to put it on and you still have to move for it to actually work. I'm sure there's an old version, you can't see the stars unless you look through a telescope type of thing.
Yeah. Like, you can't automate motivation, right? Like, you can't. I remember I said to someone, and we had a big debate about this. They're like, someone asked me, it was a work thing, I really want to work with your team because you're going to motivate me. And I said, interesting, I can't motivate you. You have to motivate yourself. We had a huge debate about this. Very junior person on my team that is now grown into a really great professional. I said, I can inspire you. The data can inspire you to know where the gaps are, to know where the opportunities are. But that is the inner work you got to do to take all that and to motivate yourself to pick your career path, to make decisions in your personal life. I would be irresponsible. I definitely can do a lot of things. I cannot do that. And so that's where I think, for me, it's an exciting conversation because innovation's exciting. exciting to see what things can do and what we have access to as, practitioners and what's coming your way, like to get signals and to have more information when your clients can identify what pain is, or when they say my knee doesn't work, what does that mean? That you now have like faster ways to figure that out to kind of train safely. But that's where I think it doesn't take, that judgment element that we keep going back to, or that the work that someone asked to do something with it. You have the information, but you don't act on it and use it. It's kind of useless.
Do you think judgment is the quality that becomes most important as AI improves?
I think so. I think it's confident judgment, right? There's one thing to have judgment. It doesn't mean it's good all the time. I've met folks that don't have good judgment, but I think it's learning to trust yourself and to be able to have the right judgment to know when can I be more confident exercising my judgment. And so I think it's confidence, but it's also like refined judgment, but also being open that you could be wrong, right? And so part of that judgment is the willingness to improve, to learn, to change your mind. And that's something that is really hard for us, because I don't know about you, but I hate getting feedback unless like it really has to be correct, because I'll challenge it, because no one ever wants to feel wrong or feel like they failed. But it's that openness and flexibility to say, I'm going to be more confident in what I know, but also in what I don't know. And it's that commitment to, how do I continue to sharpen my judgment? What is the information I'm being open to take in, knowing that, could my judgment be wrong? And that's something I have to ask myself when I'm QAing my team's work that could have, detrimental impacts. I sign off legally and financially that it's correct, because we have a statement of work with a client. And so it's something I think that, we can apply that in any element of life, to be open to sometimes, as we saw, things change and the data isn't telling us the whole story all the time. Yeah,
completely. So sport forces decision-making under fatigue and pressure in a way few environments do. How has that shaped the way you interpret data when stakes are high?
Ooh, that's it's a good question. Sometimes I think it depends on the day you get me and like how tired and what does fatigue mean, right? Because there's physical fatigue, it's really real. I think as I'm getting older, I'm also realizing the toll on mental fatigue. And that kind of really, when we go back to those three buckets on like the physical and the emotional and then the load, it's that emotional kind of load and fatigue I'm finding is more and more of a challenge. And sometimes I don't have good judgment all the time. And when I recognize, I'm like, maybe my judgment's off, it's to actually be open and to ask for help. I think, and it goes back to the High Rocks example. We were saying that, like in a race setting, or in like a really hard training block, sometimes that more information, it can be dangerous. And what I mean by that is you don't want 10 different signals that you're getting telling you all different things. You really want a couple that you can trust. So I think to kind of curb or recognize when that fatigue's happening, it's saying sometimes too much information is too much. What are the 2 or 3 consistent trusted signals I'm going to use to not increase the load? And I think that over time, it builds greater degree of confidence that you can rely on what those trends are, not how you feel in one moment. Because there could be areas, I know when I'm really tired, like a couple of days ago, I was almost falling asleep at work. I was in the middle of reviewing a really important document, that the impact of me making a bad decision was like incredibly high. So we're learning to kind of take a step back or to say, what are 2 or 3 of the signals I'm feeling like right now and why? And then really simply, when I wasn't able to kind of come up with a good answer and I knew the impact of a mistake was high, I was communicating that and actually stepping away and taking a break. Or like in a training sense, it was like stepping away from like not doing a training session, recognizing that fatigue had set in and that. So I think the reality is like our work situations, there's a lot of pressure. You have notifications, you have meetings, you have so many decisions. And this is like every day, it feels like 10 days jammed into one. And I think sometimes there's an unhealthy anxiety that a leader or an athlete can feel to try to process everything at once, which leads to burnout or people freeze. And I think with the Olympics coming up, like you're going to see that. You're going to see people that are at peak, have all the data that's telling you they're gold medal contenders, and they're just going to freeze in the moment. So I think recognizing that will avoid fatigue, but also to recognize when that fatigue's coming in so that you can kind of simplify, here are the signals I need to really kind of pay attention to. And then where do you remove the noise or just remove yourself from that situation? And as I talk about it, it's a little bit more academic than practical. There's times when you're not able to do that, but I think greater awareness, then you're able to kind of, recognize the fatigue and like have an exit plan so that you're not making a detrimental or like a decision that's going to hurt yourself, like train injured and blow out your knee or me make a bad decision and like hurt a client or like hurt a customer.
Yeah. I think like two of those things within that you mentioned are also trained skills. So one of them is awareness. And the example you brought up earlier was rowing with, the blindfold on, with no music, listening to your own thoughts, listening to how your body is reacting to boredom or fatigue or pain, and actually being in the moment to feel what that felt like, knowing that it was going to come up again and again, and especially when we went into the actual 24-hour challenge. If you just always had a screen in front of you, watching a movie, headphones on, playing music all the time, loud, buzzy gym scenario, your inputs are so high that you wouldn't be self-aware enough to feel what it feels like when you go over that 10,000 kilometer and you're like, oh, my left knee. Every time I go over 10,000 kilometers, I feel my left knee. Knowing that that's probably going to happen when you do the actual event. So that skill is a trained skill of awareness to know, okay, what does it feel like when I get tired? Okay, I know this is my checklist. And so when you're in an office environment, you feel, I missed that word that they said in the presentation. That's a signal to myself. I'm probably starting to get fatigued. Okay, I'm going to keep paying attention to my next known signal. But that's a learned skill of awareness. The other side of that too, I think, is the capacity side, right? Like knowing what your limits are, which is something I brought up for you. Is like we tested your limits to see what your capability was, so that when we got to that point, you could articulate, hey, I'm feeling at my limit, and we need to back off or push or whatever the scenario asks for. But that's another conversation that I had earlier this month was about that, was capacity, and like, for one, knowing what yours is, but then also doing things to help develop it out further, so that when you are in a high pressure situation, a decision making scenario, you're not at your absolute limit trying to make the best decision. And this is where you see, elite athletes like Kobe Bryant is always the first guy who comes to mind, where he always just seemed to be calm and at ease, even in Game 7 with, time running out on the clock. And same thing, Michael Jordan, same idea. It's like time running out on the clock. They seem to be at ease because their capacity is bigger than the situation that they're in. But those are just elements as skills that can be practiced. And that's, I think kind of what you're saying is like you practice those skills and now they show up today. Hey, just a brief word from our sponsors. One thing that kept coming up in this conversation is stress. And not just physical stress from training, but mental load that comes with high performance. That's where something like Magnesium Breakthrough from Bioptimizers comes in. It's a full spectrum magnesium supplement designed to support deeper sleep, better recovery, and help regulate your nervous system, which for most people is running way hotter than it should be. If you're having trouble winding down, staying asleep, or just feeling constantly on, this is one of the simplest things you can add that actually makes a noticeable difference. You can check it out through the link in the show notes and the discount code. And now, back to hearing more from Charlotte on how she handled pressure when everything was on the line and what that taught her about making decisions in high-stakes environments.
Yeah, and I think it's discipline, right? And this is where you see so many athletes become almost like OCD about their routines because it's worked, right? And what works for me wouldn't work for someone else. And, in a way, I remember someone said, the lazy athlete. I said, no, but you're right. Like, you have to simplify signals and remove noise. And I think simplicity isn't laziness. It's actually protection, right? To block out things that are not relevant so that you can stay laser focused and get into what you're describing. It's the flow state, right? And I knew for me, I had a routine every time I would race at nationals. I would always have around the same call time. And I knew that the night before, like what I ate, it was the same. I would go to bed at the same time. I had a locked and loaded routine up until 2 weeks before. And I remember I had other athletes saying like, doesn't that cause you stress? I'm like, no, the structure for me created simplicity, and simplicity, like it removed the noise and there was less stress up to the point where I knew like the 10 minutes before my warm-ups were the same. I still found the other day, funny enough, I found my playlist that I'd listened to that would get me wired in the same way. I was able to kind of have the discipline to flush my mind. And it became very, very simple, because by that time, even if you're like a student going in to do a test, or you're going to the boardroom doing a presentation, the prep itself is done. Like if you're still prepping and worried about it, it's not going to help you. You actually start flowing into just execution, and your mind, because there's so much stimulus happening, you actually plan has to be very simple, and you have to get really, really good and disciplined at removing the noise. And I think that that's something I find is more of a protection control mechanism, which, you know, an argued psychologist may say that that's not a good quality to have. But I found for the purposes of like peak performance at race, this is where I remember I used to go and show up at different races when I wasn't competing, and I would watch the top athlete. And I could tell you he or she 9 times out of 10 had very similar patterns of like what they would do in their prep and their execution, and even post race. And if you go early to like the hockey games, you see some of these athletes that they take a very similar approach, and they go into their routines, and it's fascinating. And they'll tell you, but this is the formula that works. And once it works, I'm not breaking it.
Yeah. I think maybe the one limitation that people might bring up with that is, well, what happens if something interrupts your flow of routine? I think in my experience, it's been still containing the routine within your control environment. So it might not start when there could be traffic getting you to the event. It may start more when you're putting your shoes on and you're already in the environment.
Yeah. And that's where I think there's a degree of like common sense and flexibility, right? Like there's certain things that are going to be outside of your control. I even know folks like for High Rocks, they're taking it like they're Olympic athletes. If they wake up and they are a little bit sick or they feel a bit off, they just won't compete because they don't want a DNF, or they, you know, and I think that's getting to a point of like extreme. We also, you know, have to live life and things happen. Yeah. But I think, you know, it goes back to simplicity, taking not 10 different points of things you have to do, but what are the 3 things? And for me, it was sleep, it was fuel, and it was showing up, not going with people to a race, showing up on my own, getting there. And I had my pre-race routine. Now that could be 2 hours before, it could be 1 hour before. But it was keeping it very simple, so that I'm like, the playbook's simple. It's not like I have this 20-line checklist of stuff. Yeah. Because the margin for error was high, and that made me feel a bit confident. Now, would I get high degree of anxiety if I was off my sleep by half an hour? Well, no, you know, and, you know, or off my food, or like my brown maple syrup, you know, flavored oatmeal wasn't there. It was green apple. No, like I think, you know, we're splitting hairs there, but I knew there was important elements that were built in behaviors that didn't just happen 24 hours before, that were lifelong, more lifestyle patterns. And I knew like, this is peak week. And then you make a call, and sometimes you're surprised, like on my example of the time trial, it wasn't supposed to be good, but sometimes that there's good mistakes. And sometimes we have these changes and, you know, they're not good results. And that's the magic, I think, of competing.
What will be cool about this time and this conversation is going into the Winter Olympics, and then, you know, and being able to actually start to witness some of these things when you see, you know, the short track speed skater, in terms of like how they warm up and how they set their feet if you watch them go through a few races, it's going to be the same setup every single time. Or the skeleton, you know, all these kind of obscure sports that you don't get to see a lot of, those are really people who are very dialed in, because it's very precise. A lot of them are short races, so they have to be locked in really quickly. There's no time to like get in the zone. They have to be in it right away. And you'll see the consistency of how they go and do their sprint, or how they go and do their slide. And it's really cool to witness. And they are very consistent. You know, it's like 2 pats on the head, slap the shield down, you know, whack the legs, and then they're ready to go. It's cool to see the consistency of it.
Yeah, it's funny. Just 2 Olympic examples that are interesting when you see kind of, you know, we talked about routine when that is off, and you still see there's a magic and the lifelong of training and discipline that can still yield really good results. When you look at Silk and Laumann, 1992 Olympics, where it got into almost a life-changing accident, and still managed to go with, I think, only, in time trials with 8 weeks to the Olympics, and came out with a bronze. Like, incredible story around all the elements changed. The signals were different, had like a huge injury, shattering, elements of her leg and a huge gash. And I mean, this is something someone could say, well, really privileged, but at the time, it wasn't easy. And she still talked about her rehab journey, and it was bands, and it was sitting in a bed, and she had all these coaches, but at the end of the day, she had to do the work and was still able to take all that good training and base and still come out successful. And I'm curious, with the Winter Olympics, you probably saw in the news, Lindsey Vonn, like US hopeful, huge accident, tore her ACL, I believe, and she's still competing. And they're showing her rehab, and I'm like, holy smokes, how is she doing that? The torn ACL. And so I think there are things that data can track, and then there's elements of the human condition that make sport exciting, because you see what people can do to push boundaries, even when the science is saying you can't.
Yeah, especially at that level, with that level of determination. And she's a good example. Mark McMorris had a big crash, a few days ago, and today they said, he feels good. He's going to get back out there. And he probably doesn't feel great, but he's going to say he does. And he's, he's going to start to switch the narrative, even just for himself, so that I feel awesome. I'm at my best. I'm going to peak here, and I'm going to get out there and compete at my best, which is a perfect segue into, you have been very deliberate about goal setting, working backwards from big outcomes. How do you think about belief and future building now compared to how you did before?
I think it's very similar. I think a lot's changed. I think for me, I'm always, I'd say, a shameless idealist. I like to have big goals and dreams, and part of it comes from, like, I feel very grateful we can do the hard things, right? Like, it is a privileged position to say that I can, afford to pay for the training and coaching I had over the years and set these big goals, like rowing across the Atlantic, that unfortunately due to COVID, we weren't able to do. Like isn't it the most socially distant sport in the world? But anyway, so we'll leave that one. And I think, like, a lot of it was, like, I didn't wake up. I wasn't raised as, like, the crazy athlete. I was picked last for the baseball team. I was, like, not particularly fit or elite. It was just kind of, this is something I picked up because I was really motivated and I wanted to do it, and had really great coaches along the way. And I think I built the belief by just showing up consistently. I'm so stubborn. And I'm like, well, if there's a will, there is a way. And it sounds squishy. It's not a good kind of answer, but I believed it was just small, repeatable, consistent daily tasks that created the confidence. And I think I also lost a lot, right? Like, I didn't win all things. I remember the first rowing meet I showed up at, I was dead last. And if you ever go to an on the water rowing race, everyone's there clapping for you. You're last because there's no one in front of you, and you have to row here and get along with that and row past the podium. And it's very humbling. But I realized in the sport, everyone claps, and no one starts the ceremony until everyone's crossed the finish line. Same with when you're on the erg at nationals, earning your seat or getting your pull time. When you're done, you don't get up and start celebrating. You wait till the last person's finished. And I think these are the things that I've translated into work, where I'm really honored and really blessed, if you could even say it. I've done some crazy things in my career that, like, I never thought I would do. And a lot of it's the support of the teammates around me. But at the end of it, it's the crazy belief that, like, why don't we just try? And, if you can believe it, I think you can achieve it. I won a world record when I was, like, in my mid 30s. I wasn't 20s, and I didn't grow up rowing on the water. I picked up rowing when I was 29. And so I think having that will and confidence through getting the small wins and learning from the mistakes has been really key to work backward from goals and see what happens.
I think one thing I loved about, and it was, for me, it was new, and I didn't really know that people did this until you kind of, showed me this. But we were talking about the goals and, like, what do we want to accomplish at the nationals? And you said very confidently, whether you confidently thought you could achieve it or not, you said, well, I have all my goals written across from my bed. So when I wake up in the morning, it's the first thing that I see. Where did you get that from?
Honestly, I don't know. I think I was a weird kid. Like, I blame my parents. Like, my dad's an engineer and my mom's a nurse. So you get the nice kind of calm bedside manner, but really smart and practical with like systems thinking kind of person. And then there's me. So I probably have, for a blessing or a curse, you can ask people on my team. But my dad always had us write everything out. He's like, if you don't visualize it, it's never going to happen. And don't be the person who talks about things and never does them. It's okay to like attempt, and it may take you long to get there, but if you're committed, you will achieve it. And so as kids, we used to have, my brothers both played competitive hockey, on our ceiling. We took rid of the popcorn ceiling and we had stuff like written down, and we'd have to do family goals. Family goals on your birthday were what you had to write out. And they were like, I don't even remember what we wrote down, but I remembered the two things I carried from childhood are always writing down goals. So I have like, chalkboard paint on one of my walls, and I still kind of write down stuff. Maybe now it's to not forget them as I get old. Yeah. But then the second thing is getting up every morning and telling myself, like, I'm going to do this. Mm-hmm. And it sounds really silly, but it's what I learned from that is you have to be your own coach. You got to be your own advocate. Like you and I could have trained together. You could have told me, you could have set the perfect program. But if I didn't fundamentally want it enough or believe in myself, I wouldn't have achieved it. And I think that just practically, it's so hard. Change is so hard. You have to be so crazy passionate about something and want it so badly to even have a chance of achieving it. Because most people don't want to feel pain. They don't want to feel suffering. Things get hard. It's not an easy path. The path to success is like fragmented. You have to have that underlying desire and belief so strong to override and like ride through the waves of change or like challenge. So I think it's worked. I have my team do it too. I'm like, write down your goals. If you don't write them down, then you won't achieve them.
Yeah, I think, it is such a cool concept. What is great about being able to do these kinds of, competitions or challenges or whatever it is, it doesn't have to be sport, it could be other things too, is that it is such a strong proof of concept, is that you set this way out there goal, I'm going to break a world record. Okay, you're crazy. Whatever, go for it. But then you actually start to work backwards. Like, what is it going to take to actually accomplish that goal? And what am I going to do today to start making my way in that direction? And then when you actually accomplish it, I'm sure some neurologist out there is going to go, well, yeah, of course, it rewires your brain. Why wouldn't it rewire your brain? You set this long-term future goal out there. You did what it took along the way. You kept adjusting and you accomplished it. And so your brain's going to go, oh, okay, well, let's do that again. And you can now apply that to basically anything that you want to do, knowing that it works. And it works for these, crazy examples of these goals. Or, if someone has like a giant weight loss goal, I'm going to lose 200 pounds. Well, if you say it and set it and write it down and you remind yourself that that's a goal that you want to accomplish, and you start thinking, even if you just start thinking about it, you're going to start to make decisions toward that thing. And, whether it happens in a year, 2 years, or 3 years, if you're reminded of it and the path of it, you will get there as long as you kind of stay on it. But you can do it in short-term things too, which is also a good way to start for people who want to accomplish things. Is like set an end of the week goal, keep reminding yourself of it every day. If you accomplish it, set a 2-week goal, do the same thing, and just start building out and start recognizing, like, the more intention you have and the more specific you are with the goal, Charlotte will tell you can achieve it.
Yeah. And I think this is where it's like, everyone is gifted in some respects, right? Like, I meet a lot of people all the time who are so talented in numbers or in art or how they communicate. Like, we all have different strengths and different gifts, but it's how you choose to apply the gifts, right? You can also choose to not apply them. And I think it goes down to that thing of like, you don't believe in yourself, it's very tough to be successful. At the end of the day, you can have all the help you want in the world. And I remember as a kid reading through, and you talked about the weight loss goal. I remember reading, I think I was like 12. I don't know. I was a weird kid. I read about Oprah Winfrey's weight loss journey with her trainer, Bob Harper. So I was so fascinated around seeing people that you wouldn't ever think would be successful hitting a goal, hit a goal. And she wrote a whole book about her, and it wasn't about the weight loss. The weight loss was part of it, but it was about the relationship with her trainer and coach that became more of a lifestyle, and how she actually built confidence from the inside out. And it was around goal setting and around how to work back from goals. And she was so successful in one part of her life, but yet still really struggled here. And it's a really good read to get that motivation, because we can all relate to that. Even if it's not a big weight loss goal, we've all had times in our life where we didn't have that confidence and true belief that we could really do it. And it's the one thing, I'm almost maybe overconfident about this in some way. I'm like, someone told me I can't row across the Atlantic. Well, I'm going to prove them wrong. And of course I can do it. Like, I just need to get coaching. I just need to work for it. Not thinking about the safety element or all the other things. I'm like, oh, I'll worry about that when it's actually a problem. But I think we have to believe in ourselves. And I truly have seen so many stories of wild outcomes. And you see it with the Olympics. Is so interesting when you see the hockey team from Kazakhstan show up. And yeah, they're not going to win gold, but they score goals and they're so happy and they celebrate because their goal is very different than Team Canada's goal.
Sure.
But
Yeah.
it's a good goal.
A little delusion goes a long way. Why does working backwards matter so much?
Because if you don't have a vision for where you're headed, you don't have kind of that North Star or like path to get to. I think, it's like when you are rowing, you have a spot where the race finishes. It's not just hitting a certain time, but it's like a direct path of like point A to point B. Now, to get to point B, there's many steps you have to get there to refine your approach, your plan, your technique, etc. I think the same thing goes to, achieving anything. I really believe in the work back. I do this with teams. We have to set a vision for what's the outcome we want to achieve. Now, the time it's taking, the technique that we have to get there, the activities that we need to do along the way, without a vision or goal, then how can you plan? And this is where sometimes I've said to folks when I started coaching rowing, I was like the worst. And I always said I'd be the worst personal trainer, because I would say to students in the class, like, you really need to think about your goal for this class. It can't just be to come in and get a sweat. And this is where I'm like, oh, there's a factor of fun there. But for some people, their goal's fun. For others, there's a metric. For others, it's just showing up. And I think no matter what the outcome is, if you can't visualize that or see the outcome, then the path to get there is going to be messy. And that's where people start to lose motivation. So having that for me is a framework, I think, that helps you balance priorities. It helps you make better decisions in the moment when I have many different outcomes I'm looking toward getting. But it's that prioritization is going to be really important, because there is switching costs, right? So if you have too many outcomes and too many things you're trying to do at once, like I think maybe you said this to me, like strength and performance and aesthetic, these are all important outcomes, but you have to make a decision. You can achieve all these things at once, because they often are inverted goals. But at different seasons of what we're in different phases, the outcome's going to change, but the big goal and vision is going to be the same. And so I think that these are important. Why I really appreciate having a coach, because there's different things that you would have seen in our process that I didn't see or know, but it would be part of your approach to know when to guide me to make different decisions, and like what was that path so we could pace toward hitting that outcome.
I think I would just add to that too, that, knowing your end target also helps you determine if you are on path or off path as well.
Right. And you can see if you're successful, is we all need those little boosts of confidence to go, like, no one ever wants to feel like they're losing and not winning. We're all competitive and we're all very self-motivated. I do believe that. No one's just ever really doing things for fun. Maybe it happens sometimes, but I think we do need a confidence boost along the way if we are looking to make better decisions and really preserve kind of some of that energy that's going to help us, along the way to be successful.
JJ started skating this year, and one thing I asked him was, "What do you want to get out of this first first skating session?"
Poor kid.
Like, I just want to stand up. I'm like, all right, that's a good goal.
That's a good goal. I just want to have fun, Dad. Am I allowed to have fun?
Yeah. As long as you have a goal. No, just kidding.
There you go.
One thing I've always respected is how you anticipate pressure instead of reacting to it. So how do you plan for periods when everything is about to get heavy?
I think I'm definitely a planner. I think I just have to with my clients of a big team I work with. I like to look at things. I didn't normally like this, and it's not for everyone, but I like to look at season by season or quarter by quarter, knowing that there's certain periods for me are just really, really busy. I like at work. So those are periods someone asked me, like, are you competing in High Rocks in May? In Ottawa, it's going to be really big. And I'm like, I'd love to. I can't, because it's a 12 to 16 week training commitment. I did that all last summer, was in bed every night at 8. because I had a lighter client schedule. And so for me, just getting out in front of kind of some of those things and knowing that there's certain periods I'm going to have to say no. But it's really getting ahead of that. And then secondly, communicating to those around me when I'm not going to be as present in my personal life, knowing that training's kicked up or work is really kicked up, right? And so if I know like there's a client I'm working with in the UK, so I'm up on calls most mornings at 6:30 a.m. Eastern, where I'm sitting in Toronto, it means my morning workouts are just not going to happen because I'm not getting up at 4 a.m. to train properly, but I'm going to adjust and train in the evenings, which I hate, but it's just going to be for a period of time. So I think it's just always making trade-offs. And I think I'm not in that super competitive track anymore. Now I'm being competitive for fun versus competitive for some of these outcomes. So the training outcome or that vision goal has changed. But I kind of have to prioritize if these are things that are bringing me joy if I want to fit it all in.
And it sounds like out of that too, a big thing is knowing what your schedule looks like being able to lay it all out in front of yourself and say like, anticipating that period of time is going to get really busy. How am I going to prepare for that? One of the things that I remember you mentioning at one point, we kind of knew work was going to get really crazy. Maybe there was a job change in that time period. Your training was going to really ramp up, and you sort of knew the day was basically going to go from like 6 a.m. to like 9 p.m. every single day for, 5 days a week. And one thing you did was prepped, I think it was, if I remember, it was like 60 meals. It was because you knew you didn't want to get off track with your eating. That was really important in what you're trying to accomplish. And when this had happened in the past, you kind of relied on what was in the area or what was being delivered for meetings at lunch and whatever. And it was never really the best options. And I remember you saying, this weekend, I'm going to spend 2 full days prepping 60 meals. I'm going to label them. They're going to go in the freezer. Every night before, I'm going to take out what I need to take out for the following day. And I'm basically going to have what I need for the next 3 weeks while everything goes crazy. And that was like, massive check mark for me. I was like, all right, Charlotte's on it. She knows what to do.
She's on it. And I think sometimes we have to give ourselves forgiveness, right? Like I don't have I have a lot more time than some of the people in my peer group, right? Like a lot of my friends have young families, something happens, someone forgot to do a school project. Like I don't have children. So, but I also have a job that's crazy and it's busy. And so we only have so much capacity and time, and it's the priorities. Like we look at a bucket and we need time to recover and rest or do other things that have nothing to do with our goals. Just be human and have fun. And I don't know, go out with our friends and be social. And so I call this stuff life. And sometimes life will get in the way. And even now, like I love a good workout. I love getting up to train. My schedule doesn't allow me all the time. And so I'm like, well, what's the next best option? And so I have I'm back at the office on most days. Like I have a walking pad. So I have a walking pad at home. And when I'm not with external clients, just with my team, I'll be walking. So the days I can't get in a workout, I get 30,000 steps in. And that's maybe not ideal. It's not my first choice, but at least I've done something and I just have to accept that. Right. And so I think that these are all things where at a minimum, we just have to give ourselves grace and shouldn't get stressed over missing a workout or eating a cookie. Like, I think that's, again, I look at, if we were Olympic athletes like Lindsay and, Mike and them are training very different protocol. But I think for the average person in that, like life's going to happen. And, sometimes you got to buckle down and do the stuff that's uncomfortable. But if you get off track, you just go back on track. Right. And that's where that structure and discipline is really helpful. So it becomes a pattern, not something you're constantly thinking about every day.
Yeah, and be flexible when things get messy and not, beat yourself up on it. You're not being paid as an athlete to train multiple times a day, and your food's not being delivered to your door, and you got to give yourself a little bit of grace.
I do remember, one thing actually on that. Yeah. When we sat with the dietitian, it's something that your listeners will find very fascinating. So I hope I don't out anyone, but I think it's okay because I won't say who it is. She is the dietitian for a major sports team or one of the major sports teams, in one of the leagues. And when we brought in our training data, she said, you have to remember that even professional athletes don't follow training protocols. So she would come in and advise them on the meal plan. They obviously had the money and budget where all the stuff's getting catered. And she's like, very few of them actually follow the meal plan, which is problematic. I'm like, maybe this is why they're losing all the time. And so, but it was just interesting. And I think we have to remember people are human, right? And people want to have a life and not be on plan and on track all the time. And I think you have to figure out what works for you and what things that you can drop the ball on and flex versus other things if you're not meeting your goals, like where you actually have to buckle down and eat the boring food, or get up every morning when you're tired and just get in and do some movement to until that pattern's established.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm all for a high standard, but we hold athletes to this extremely high standard, and most of them aren't really anywhere near it. They like the sport. Usually, they like that they get paid for the sport, but they're not necessarily knocking it out of the park every day. So when other people who are professionals in other fields are trying to operate at this extreme standard for stuff like that, there's nuance and room for it for sure. If you were preparing today for a major endurance or performance goal, how would you use AI without letting it override human judgment?
Yeah, I think for me, I have a bunch of prompts, and I posted about this on LinkedIn, how I use them to collate all the data out of my FitnessPal and Apple Watch and that to help just adjust some of my training load and plan, because I was kind of training seriously for High Rocks, but also not training seriously. And so I just, I had a coach I was working with and doing strength coming back from long COVID and that. I think the biggest thing for me was actually just scheduling it like I would a meeting. So I live by my calendar, super prioritize things. And if I was really training seriously to say get on podium, a very serious goal versus just completing it, which is what I've been doing. I think I'd have to lock in and actually question even before I committed to doing it. Do I actually have the time and space to do it the way that I would want to train? And I think it's the same argument that a lot of athletes will have when they get asked to join a beer league or a fun league after they've been competing. But I think now it's actually recognizing the load it's taking. I'm almost 43, busy job. My body doesn't move the same way. I get inflamed really quickly. I've overcome a lot of injuries, and part of it is I've done it a couple of times. Is that it? Is it bringing me the most joy, or do I want to focus on other things? And so, for the amount of training investment I'd have to put in to move from finishing High Rocks at a decently competitive time to getting to podium, it may not have space in my life right now. Now, if I was having the flexibility to train 4 hours a day and eat and sleep during the day and do stuff, very different, but the outcome I still may not get there for a number of different reasons. And so I think for me, it would be going back to basics, what does good look like? What is the goal and vision? Second, how long do I have time to realistically achieve the goal? And then third, what is the things that I don't have control over that I'm going to have to be comfortable with that may get in the way, but it's not going to demotivate me to keep to plan, knowing that maybe part of the goal is just finishing. I won't reach podium. And that's a hard conversation, I think, to have when I'm so competitive, is in the past, to your point, I've had a lot of success. And I'm at a stage where it's where do I want to spend my time? Proving something to myself that I can do it, or repurposing the time to do something else. And so I don't know, I have to pick a race for this year still. So, it may be just a chill year to reflect and re-energize, and maybe get back in the race circuit in 2027.
What would you automate and what would you refuse to automate?
Honestly, I already automated a lot of stuff, like grocery shopping. I haven't been in a grocery store since 2019. I just hate it. I know some people think it's weird. I don't care if someone picks up my vegetables for me. I let Instacart kind of, not a paid ad for them. I let them do the picking. I don't care. I set up stuff. Same with routine things. I just hate doing that stuff, as I have so few free time now. And so that's all the life admin stuff can automate. What I like doing, funny enough, out of the life admin is I love cleaning, because I haven't met a service when I've had to use them that I can't do myself. And this is the Polish upbringing. My parents will come over and look at the baseboards and you didn't clean this. And you are right, I didn't. There's still dirt on it. So, so those are things there. I think, I really like to work. I like to problem solve and create things. And so I think even, you probably played the game with your friends. What would you do if you won the lottery? I'm I would still work. Otherwise I'd be really bored. I want to be able to find purpose. I know you're hungry. I know. Stanley's I want dinner. But that there are things that I think are going to be important for me to show up being me, that bring me joy. I don't think I'm ever going to be the person that would say automate everything. And I think I wouldn't want people to become robotic, which I worry about the younger generation with all the automation is relying so much on tech. People are forgetting to do things that makes us human.
Yeah, and do the things that you actually enjoy doing.
Yeah.
Okay, final question. Where can people follow your work or learn more about what you're building and thinking about now?
It's going to be an unpopular answer. So I don't have social anymore. I know everyone's like, you don't. I'm like, no. But LinkedIn. LinkedIn's the best. They can follow me on LinkedIn. I do a lot of posting, a lot of content. It's a mix between AI and then all the fitness stuff through my role at Purchase Action, and where the two worlds blend together. And I show up, and I'm lucky to people want to have me speak at stuff and do workshops. So I post if I'm speaking at conferences and that. But the LinkedIn's the best spot.
That's perfect. And we will share that in the show notes where they can connect with you.
Awesome.
For listeners who should definitely take your LinkedIn profile and connect with Charlotte.
Awesome.
All right. Thank you, Charlotte, for joining the podcast, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you, Joe. Cheers. Always a pleasure.
If you took something from this episode, it's probably a clearer understanding of where data helps and where it doesn't make it the decision for you. That's really what the conversation comes down to. Performance isn't just about having more information, it's about knowing what matters and being able to act on it when it counts. If you enjoyed the episode, I appreciate you take a minute to leave a 5-star review. On Spotify, you can do that right on the show page. On Apple Podcasts, scroll to the ratings and reviews and tap the stars. It helps more people find the show and keeps the conversation going. Big thank you to our podcast sponsors, Whoop for data and recovery tracking, ATP Labs for high-quality supplementation, Trainerize for coaching and program delivery, Cala Red Light, and Bioptimizers. All of the links and discount codes are in the show notes. Appreciate you all being here, and we'll see you on the next episode. Thank you, everyone, for hanging in for the full episode. I appreciate you all. Quick reminder about the brands that make this podcast possible and the offers that you can take advantage of. These are products I use daily, and they help me perform at my best, recover faster, and stay on top of my game. Coaches, you know how hard it is to juggle clients' programs, progress tracking, and communicate. I've been there too. After years of grinding it out, I finally found Trainerize. It brings everything I need for coaching into one platform. Whether I'm onboarding new clients, scaling my business, or keeping people accountable, it just works. I've tried other platforms over the years, but for the last 3 years, Trainerize has been my go-to. It's easy for me to grow and for my clients to stay consistent. If you're a coach looking for flexibility and simplicity, check it out. Use the link in the show notes to get your first month with Trainerize for free. Here's the thing. Good sleep and recovery aren't optional, especially if you're trying to train hard, stay sharp, and keep up with life. That's why I use Bioptimizers. Magnesium Breakthrough and Sleep Breakthrough have been game changers for me. I've tried other products, but these ones deliver. High quality ingredients and noticeable results. If you want better sleep, digestion, or recovery, Bioptimizers fills the gaps your diet can't. Trust me, you'll feel the difference. Use the link in the show notes and the code 3FACE10 to get 10% off your order. I used to stress about getting perfect sleep, and ironically, it ruined my sleep. That's when I started using Whoop. Whoop gave me clear insights on my recovery, strain, and sleep patterns, so I stopped guessing and started optimizing. It created a positive feedback loop for better sleep, better decisions, and better training. If you want to train smarter and recover better, Whoop is the tool you need. Use the link in the show notes and get the device and your first month with Whoop for free. Nutrition is the foundation of performance. That's why I trust ATP Labs. From Supreme Beef to MyoPrime Creatine and Pure Essential Amino Acids, these products fill the gaps in my nutrition and help me recover faster, train harder, and perform at my best. ATP Labs uses high-quality ingredients you can feel good about, and you'll feel the difference. If you're serious about fueling your performance, check them out. Use the link in the show notes and the code 3FACE10 to get 10% off of your orders. Thanks for sticking it out through the ads, and we'll see you on the next episode.